Hi, this is Larry Varvel here at First United Methodist Church in Broken Arrow with the sixth and last of this series that I've been teaching here on Wednesday evenings that I've been calling Israel and Palestine, Islam and Judaism. Over the last 5 sessions, I've talked about the birth of Islam, the life story of Muhammad and how his feeling and call as a prophet became the new religion of Islam. Talked about the growth of Islam, how it went from this one man to the entire Arabian Peninsula to really dominating the Middle East in a very short amount of time. We've talked some about the practice of Islam and about the 2 major sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia. We've also talked about Judaism. Judaism as it's described, of course, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, going back to the call of Abraham, and Abraham's children, which become known as not only the children of Abraham, but the children of Israel, how the family of Abraham grows into a nation that God says will be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, that the whole world will be blessed by the people of Israel. And I've talked a little bit about more modern history as Islam grew to dominate the Middle East, as the history of the Jewish people went not only the things we know from the Old Testament, but that period that's called the intertestamental period, the 400-year gap between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, the place where we see Israel at the beginning of the New Testament in the 1st century with Rome dominating the Jewish people in Palestine and Judea. I've taken that really all the way into modern times and traced especially how the Jewish people have been persecuted, have been ostracized, have often been a wandering people, a dispersed people. And so today, having given us all that background about the Jewish people and the Islamic movement, I want to really look at the current situation. I want to look at current affairs a little bit, the modern state of Israel and her neighbors, and how that's all working together. Or in many cases, how it's not working together. Now, just to recap, and I'm going to put a couple of maps up. If you look at the Middle East, and you see the area there and dominated by these countries, and you have to almost hunt to find Israel. Israel is a very, very small nation compared to its neighbors, compared to Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria and even Jordan. Israel is a very small country. And then if we zoom in and switch to the map that shows just Israel, you can see there that Israel, if you look at the legend, Israel is only about 150 miles or less from north to south. It's only 60 or so miles from east to west. It is a very small country relative to its neighbors. It's about the size of some of our medium-sized states. It's not a big piece of geography. And yet this country of Israel is so much the nexus and the center of so much turmoil, so much history, so much fighting. So much of what happens in the world today and in the Middle East is centered around the existence of the modern state of Israel. Just a reminder, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but the modern state of Israel was born in 1948, following the events of World War II. At the end of World War II, the end of the Holocaust, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews who'd been displaced. There had been, of course, 6 million Jews who'd been murdered by the Nazi regime. And the newly formed United Nations looked at the area of Palestine and said, what are we going to do with the Jewish people? What are we going to do with the Palestinian people? And the United Nations came up with a plan of a 2-state solution, 2 states, an Arab-Palestinian state and a Jewish state of Israel that would both exist in the land of Palestine. And then they came up with a plan that the city of Jerusalem would become really an international city, not part of Israel or Palestine, but it would be almost a sovereign, internationally controlled city for all people who see it as a holy place in the center of their faith. This was the plan the United Nations came up with. The Jewish people, the Zionists, accepted the plan. The Palestinian Arab leaders did not accept the plan because they saw the Jewish immigrants as invaders. For hundreds of years before this, Palestine had been Arab land, had been Muslim land. Jewish immigration back to the Holy Land only really started in the 1800s. And you get back to the question of who was there first? Who does the land belong to? And as we've talked about, the land of Palestine and Israel has passed through so many empires, so many different rulers, so many countries, that to say, we were here first, well, how far back do you want to go? The Jewish people, of course, held on to the promise that they said, God gave us this land. But the Muslim people, the Arab people, did not embrace that and did not necessarily agree with that. And they said, well, for hundreds of years, this has been our land. For generations, this has been our land. So the Palestinian Arabs did not believe that half of the land should be given to the Jews. They wanted to hold on to all of it. So they didn't agree with the United Nations proposal. And when that happened, the Zionist leaders in Israel declared that they were a sovereign nation. They took the borders of that territory that the United Nations had drawn up for them, and they said, this is our country, this is our nation. We're not going to wait on our Arab neighbors to declare or agree. This is the new state of Israel, and they declared it to be a nation state. That was immediately followed by invasion and war from their Arab neighbors. The upshot of that war was that Israel's borders actually increased instead of decreased. They took about 22% of the, quote, Arab land, the Palestinian land, and enlarged their borders. We know that about a couple of decades later, in 1967, Israel was once again at war with her neighbors. And at this time, again, Israel increased its borders to include land that was taken from Jordan, that was taken from Egypt, that was taken from Syria. And Israel now controlled an even wider part of territory that came to be known as the State of Israel. Now, if you look at the map of Israel, you'll notice, especially on this map that I'm going to put up, Israel is bordered by Egypt on the southwest. It's bordered by Jordan on the east. It's bordered by Syria on the north. It's bordered by Lebanon, also on the north. You'll notice the Jordan River that runs between Israel and Jordan, and you see the Dead Sea there in the middle of that. But you notice also two territories inside of Israel, and those in the gray are the Palestinian territories. The large Palestinian territory, sort of smack dab in the middle of Israel, is usually referred to as the West Bank because it is on the west bank of the Jordan River. The other little slice that is gray is right there on the Mediterranean, the Gaza Strip. And that is that land that borders right up against Egypt there on the south of Israel on the Mediterranean, the Gaza Strip. These two territories in the gray are part of Israel, and yet they are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. They are the homelands of Palestinian Arab Muslims. And this is what you hear so much about, the turmoil, the tension in Israel. Whether or not there can ever be a two-state solution, whether or not that area known as the West Bank can become a sovereign nation and not really a part of Israel. It's a little bit of a contradiction. The Palestinians control those territories. They control the utilities. They control the police. They control, the trash collection and the water and all those sort of things. They have their own governing authorities. They have their own schools. And yet they are not truly sovereign. The Jewish military, the Israeli military, still exercises a certain control over those territories. And indeed, there is a wall surrounding the West Bank. I'll talk more about that later. But there's about 400 miles of wall that walls off the Palestinian territories from the rest of Israel. Now, Israel is a country of about 8 million people. About 3/4 of those people are Jewish. About 6 million of those, 75% of the population of Israel is Jewish. A little under 2 million people in Israel/Palestine are Palestinians. Most of them Muslims, most of them Arabs, most of them Sunni Muslims living in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Now the Jews are of all different kinds of Jews. There are Orthodox Jews, but Orthodox Jews are not the majority. There are Reform Jews, and there are many, many secular Jews or non-practicing Jews. These would be Jewish people who identify themselves as Jewish culturally, racially, and yet they do not practice Judaism in any significant way. They don't practice the religion of Judaism, but they still consider themselves culturally Jewish. Israel is not a religious country in the same way that some of the Muslim countries are. Many of the Muslim countries think of themselves as a theocracy. Many of the Muslim countries look to the Quran as the basis of their laws, some more than others. Now, Israel, of course, honors the Torah and the Old Testament traditions, and the Ten Commandments are the foundation of their law, much as they are of all Western countries. But in the same way, many, many Israeli Jews are not religious Jews. They do not necessarily follow the kosher laws or the Sabbath laws. They don't dress in the traditional way. There is a significant population of Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews in Israel. And when we were walking around Israel in January, my wife and I, there would be large numbers of men wearing black hats, black coats, white shirts, long untrimmed beards, very obviously identified as Orthodox Jews. But they were not the majority. The majority of Jews in Israel are not Orthodox, and actually many Jews in Israel do not practice Judaism. Israel is a democracy. It has an assembly, a legislature they call the Knesset. It has a prime minister. The current prime minister is Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel is one of the best educated countries in the world. It has the highest standard of living of any country in the Middle East. There are many, many political parties in Israel. It's not like here where you have just two major parties. Israel has a number of political parties. Usually no one party has a majority in the Knesset, so they have to form coalitions to be able to pick a prime minister. Often the Orthodox Jewish Party, which is a small party, it has a lot of weight because depending on who they throw their weight with may depend on who gets to be the prime minister. The more liberal parties, the more conservative parties. Netanyahu is more of a conservative. There are Palestinian citizens of Israel. There are Arab citizens of Israel. There are Christian citizens of Israel. They are eligible to serve in the Knesset, and some have. Now remember, Israel is a democracy. Only two of Israel's neighbors recognize Israel's right to exist. Only two of her neighbors actually recognize it as a legitimate country, Egypt and Jordan. The rest of her neighbors don't even recognize Israel as a legitimate country. They call them an occupying force. And so Israel has good relations with Jordan. It has okay relations with Egypt, although they have been better in the past. Now I mentioned these Palestinian territories. When my wife and I were traveling in Israel in January, we went into the Palestinian territories twice. We went into Jericho, which is on the West Bank, and we went into Bethlehem, which is also a part of the West Bank. Both times we went into the Palestinian territories, we had to go through the checkpoints. We had to go through a gate into the wall that surrounds the West Bank. And you know, we never felt unsafe. We never felt like there was any danger to that. The Palestinian people there want tourists as much as the Israelis want tourists. They want Americans to come and visit the holy places that are a part of the West Bank, and so they're very gracious. They're a little aggressive in wanting you to buy the merchandise, but we saw that everywhere you go in foreign travel. But we experienced when we would cross from the Israeli parts of Israel, go through the gates, through the wall, into the Palestinian territories, there was very much an immediate change in terms of the standard of living. The Palestinians' territory looked much, much poorer. It looked to have a much lower standard of living. You almost felt like you were going from more prosperous Western-style nation into more of a third world kind of situation. And many of the Palestinian people, of course, feel that they have been put in a ghetto, that they are virtual prisoners behind this wall. Our tour guide talked about this wall that was put up and how much he said Israelis hate the wall. But from an Israeli standpoint, it is for security and safety because of some of the uprising and attacks that have come from some hot-headed Palestinians. From the Palestinian viewpoint, the wall is there to hem them in, to keep them away from economic opportunity, to make their lives miserable. And you discover very quickly that depending on who you talk to, if you talk to a Palestinian, if you talk to an Israeli Jew, you'll get a very, very different take on the situation in Israel. Now, two different Palestinian organizations control these two pieces of land. The West Bank is controlled by what's called Fatah, which is an offshoot of what we would probably in the West once know as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which then transitioned into an administrative government. But the Palestinians are actually splintered into two groups. Fatah controls the West Bank. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip. Hamas is a more radical Palestinian organization. When we hear on the news about rockets being fired into southern Israel from the Gaza Strip, that's coming from Hamas. Hamas, which is more likely to resort to more violent means to try to provoke a battle between themselves and the Israelis. Now, as I said, the Palestinians in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, they are in control of education and healthcare and police, but the Israelis still control the borders and often control what can go in and what can go out. And this is an extreme sore spot for the Palestinians. The Israelis control how much water goes into the Palestinian territories. They control what building materials can go into the Palestinian territories. Again, from the Palestinian standpoint, it's we want to repair our houses, we want to fix our walls, and the Israelis won't allow building materials to come into the territory. From the Israeli standpoint is we know that certain building materials that have been allowed to go in there have been used to build tunnels that have allowed terrorists to come in and commit acts of violence. And you can see how depending on which side of the wall you're on, and depending on whether you're a Jew or a Palestinian Arab or a Palestinian Christian for that matter, how you view this situation as different. From a Jewish standpoint, from an Israeli standpoint, they say, look how far we have bent over to try and accommodate, to make peace, given up territory, given up control so that we can have peace. And yet the Palestinians continue to attack us, to knife us, to throw rocks at our soldiers. From the Palestinian standpoint, it is, this is our land, and these are occupiers, and they arrest us without warrant, and they brutalize our young people, and we are persecuted, and we're mistreated, and we don't have rights the way the Israelis have rights. And it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And as a Christian pastor, one of the things that I've noticed, and I was reading about this, is someone was talking about this situation. They said, you have to realize in Israel and in Palestine, it is always a matter of tit for tat. It is always a matter of an eye for an eye. It's always a matter of getting even. It's always a matter of they did this, so we're going to do this. They hurt us, we're going to hurt them. It's a constant back and forth and back and forth. And, you know, as a Christian, in our better moments, we embrace the teachings of Jesus, which, remember, Jesus says, you have heard it said, in other words, in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. But Jesus says, but I say, turn the other cheek. Pray for those who persecute you. If someone forces you to carry their pack for a mile, carry it for two. Go the extra mile. The teachings of Christianity, at our best, are about not taking revenge, not taking an eye for an eye, but among both Judaism and Islam, there is a stronger strain of you got to respond. You got to respond back and forth, tit for tat, eye for an eye. And the animosity, the hatred between Palestinians and Israelis goes back not just to 1948, it goes back centuries. We might say it even goes back millennia. It goes back to slights and battles and curses that go back centuries and centuries and centuries, with both the Palestinians and the Israelis saying, this is our land. This belongs to us. One of the things I try to caution folks about is that some Christian pastors really are very much only see Israel's side. You go into a few of our more conservative Christian churches and you'll see at the front there'll be an American flag and an Israeli flag. Some Christian pastors sort of promote a message of Israel right or wrong because they identify the modern secular country of Israel that was founded in 1948 as being synonymous with the biblical Israel that the Bible talks about. I don't see it that way. I don't see the modern state of Israel, which is a secular nation, as being synonymous with the ancient nation of Israel that we read about in the Old Testament. As I said, Israel today is a very secular country, and it is not based on an Old Testament model in any such way. It is the largest number of Jews of any place in the world, although the USA has almost as many Jews as the state of Israel. Of course, we're a much, much larger country, a country of over 300 million compared to a country of 8 million. But we have to be careful, I think, when we're talking about Israel and Palestine to realize that the answers are not very simple. When it comes down to who's right, the Israelis or the Palestinians, my sympathy probably is more with the Israelis, but it's probably 60-40. It's not 100%, 0%. I think the Israelis have been more rational, more accommodating than the Palestinian leadership has been, but the Israelis are not blameless. The Israelis are not blameless in some of the decisions and treatment on their side. It's a very, very complicated situation. Now, let's think about the neighbors around Israel and how their relations are. I mentioned Egypt. Egypt, which has a long border with Israel, is a much larger nation, both population and geographically. Egypt has a population of about 90 million people, much, much bigger territory. Egypt has gone through its own turmoil. We think about the Middle East, and we talk about the Arab Spring from 2011, when there was a movement across the Middle East in Arabic countries, Muslim countries, of a move towards more openness, more democracy, more of an open feeling, more of a joining of the world community, less hostility, less isolation. That Arab Spring in most countries actually backfired. And in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt, who was someone who would work with Israel and someone who would work with us in the United States, he was ousted. A new leader was chosen out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist movement in many countries, including Egypt. That president was ousted by the Egyptian military, and the Egyptian military installed their own leader, El-Sisi, who is the current president of Egypt. Egypt is not as friendly towards Israel or the U.S. or as stable as it was 5 years ago. It is still a relatively, in terms of its relation with Israel, they still honor the treaty. They still recognize Israel as a sovereign nation who has a right to exist. But the tension there is worse than it was a few years ago. Egypt is a country that is 90% Sunni Muslim. It is 9% Christian, Coptic Christians. When we think about Egypt, of course, again, taking the long view of history, we may not even remember that up until the birth of Islam, Egypt was a Christian nation. The majority of the citizens of Egypt before the 7th century were Christian. Coptic Christian. But as Islam spread across the Middle East, Egypt turned from being a predominantly Christian country to a predominantly Muslim country. Egypt is a place where the human rights situation is not great. Now, as bad as sometimes the situation in Egypt has been with the Arab Spring, the turmoil in Egypt is nothing compared to the turmoil in Israel's neighbor to the northeast, Syria. You may remember that I talked about Syria previously being part of the Ottoman Empire. At the end of World War I, the control of Syria passed over to the French. Syria became an independent nation in 1945. Actually, in 1958, Syria and Egypt merged to form the United Arab Republic, but that fell apart. And the turmoil in Syria goes back to the rise of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party, of course, is a party we hear about primarily in Iraq, but there's also the Ba'ath Party in Syria. And all of that culminates in more recent history in 1970 when the Assad family comes to power in Syria. From 1970 until the year 2000, for 30 years, Syria is ruled by Hafez al-Assad. When he dies in 2000, he is succeeded by his son, Bashir al-Assad, as the president and ruler of Syria. There was much optimism that when Bashir al-Assad became the president and leader and ruler of Syria, that Syria would become much more moderate and open. After all, Bashir al-Assad was educated in the West, and very educated, cultured man, very familiar with Western ways. It has not turned out that way. And as the Arab Spring came about, the Arab Spring in Syria turned into really civil war. Now, the Assad family are Alawite Muslims. Alawite is a branch of Shia. Remember, it's not as simple as this. There's Shia and Sunni. Within Shia and Sunni, there are subgroups in both branches of Islam, just like there are in Protestantism. It's not. You can't just say, well, there's Catholics and there's Protestants. Well, no, within Protestants, there's multiple different denominations. Same way, there are different brands or kinds or denominations of Sunni Islam. There are different kinds of Shia Islam. And the Assad family are Alawite Shia, which is a challenge because Syria is about 75% Sunni. So the ruling family from 1970 until the present in Syria has been a brand of Shia Islam over a country that's 75% Sunni and 10% Christian, and only about 13% Shia. And you can see how that is a recipe for the strife that we see in Syria. You can see how ISIS, which itself is an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, which are both Sunni movements, would be naturally opposed to Assad's ruler, his reign as a Shiite Muslim. And the Arab Spring is sort of the spark that sets off the civil war in Syria. What's frustrating for us in the West is looking for a good guy, because you have Assad, who he and his father both brutal dictators, persecutors of any of their opponents, ruthless in their clutching of control and elimination of enemies. And the enemy who arises, ISIS, is of course even a more bloodthirsty and more vicious group. And so you have an evil dictator and an insurgency that is itself incredibly evil and bloodthirsty and fighting each other. And we are saying, well, where's the good guys? And there is a small slice of pro-democracy, pro-Western Syrians, but they themselves are splintered among several groups. If you look at a list of all the groups fighting each other in Syria, it is dozens of different groups all fighting each other. And us trying to figure out, and the Russians all trying to figure out, well, who do we support and who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, is incredibly complicated. And I don't have time or frankly, the knowledge to go into all of that, other than to say Syria is a nation that is three-quarters Sunni with a ruling family that is a particular brand of Shia in the middle of an insurgency from ISIS, which is an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, which is a Sunni movement, all of which looks back to the Arab Spring, which many thought, oh, this is the birth of a new day in the Middle East, a more open and a more tolerant time in the Middle East, and in so many countries it has not turned out that way. Now, one place that is a bright spot, because after sort of that bad news, let me talk about something more positive. Of all the Arab nations and of all the Muslim nations in the Middle East, really the bright spot is Jordan. Jordan, which shares the largest border with Israel, is really a shining star in the Middle East and in the Arab world. They have peaceful relations with Israel. They have a stable government. They have the most open government of any Arab country. They have the best human rights of any Arab country. They've been in the news recently. They have opened their borders to refugees. There's almost 2 million Palestinian refugees living in Jordan. There's 1.5 million Syrian refugees living in Jordan. Jordan became the haven for Iraqi Christians who fled Iraq during the turmoil there. It is a constitutional monarchy. It is ruled by King Abdullah II, again, who is a very moderate, reasonable ruler. Their legislature includes mandatory women participation and Christian participation. As I said, it has the best human rights of any Arab nation, any Muslim nation. It is 92% Sunni, so it is predominantly a Sunni nation. It is 6% Christian, which is a decrease. Back in 1950, Jordan was 30% Christian. Many Christians have moved out of the Middle East altogether, and of course have just been overwhelmed by the fact that Muslim birth rates are so much higher than Christian birth rates that just the natural population growth has made the Christian population of many of these countries become a smaller and smaller and smaller piece of the pie, because Muslim families tend to be 6, 7, 8, 10 children. And over a couple of generations, you can see how that plays out. So Jordan is a great spot. When we were traveling around Israel, and we were there on the Jordan River, and you look across the Jordan River, and there's Jordan. And there's really no problem at all between Israel and Jordan. That's not to say it's a love fest, but they get along, and tourists often go back and forth between Israel and Jordan. People travel in Jordan without any problem at all, Westerners, and feel it's a very secure country. And really a model that we wish we could take what's happening in Jordan, and it can be just duplicated in so many of these other Arab and Middle Eastern countries. Let's talk a little bit farther afield from the immediate neighbors of Israel, instead of Jordan and Syria and Egypt. Let's talk about a couple of other places that have been in the news so much in the last generation that talk about the religious situation there. Let's talk about Iraq. I've mentioned before that Iraq's borders were drawn by the West, by the League of Nations in 1920. When the Ottoman Empire was defeated at the end of World War I, they drew some very artificial borders to say this is a country. And one of the countries that was created really by the League of Nations was the country of Iraq. Iraq was under British domination until they established what they called the Kingdom of Iraq, and a monarchy there in 1921. That monarchy was overthrown, again by elements of what came to be the Ba'ath Party. But and the Ba'ath Party is a Sunni movement. Iraq, as the borders were drawn, is a Shia majority country. But the reality is that when the Ba'ath Party came to power, one man eventually established himself as the military dictator of Iraq, and that is Saddam Hussein. The Ba'ath Party controlled Iraq from 1968 until the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003. here's one of the problems with that, and I always have to be careful, because when we say Iraq and Iran, sometimes they sound, we get confused. We're talking about Iraq. When Iraq was invaded by the coalition forces in 2003 and Saddam Hussein was overthrown, Saddam was the leader of what's called the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is a Sunni political party, a Sunni political party ruling over a country that is 65% Shiite. When the U.S.-led coalition overthrew Saddam and they began to establish a new government in Iraq, one of the decisions was no member of the Ba'ath Party will be allowed to participate in the government in any way. No, not in the military, not in the police, not in any government office. Well, that included not only all the former soldiers, it included 40,000 teachers who had joined the Ba'ath Party just so that they could have jobs. They weren't political. That was just, if you were going to be a teacher in Iraq, you had to join that party. Suddenly, you had a huge percentage of the population that were government workers that were barred from being a part of the government. All the government work now went to Shiites. The new government leader was exclusively Shiite. That created an atmosphere where the tensions that were already there, because Saddam Hussein persecuted the Shiites for decades, now the Shiites are in power and they exclude the Sunnis from any kind of power sharing, any kind of government job. And so that creates the insurgency. And that creates Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This Sunni movement that fights the new Shiite government in Iraq. And that's the law of unintended consequences. That's way beyond me in terms of politics and military. But it created an atmosphere where all those tensions between Shia and Sunni in Iraq come to the fore. Not to mention the Kurds, because Iraq is really made up of three groups: Shiite Arabs, Sunni Arabs, and Kurds. And Kurds there in the north of Iraq are really their own ethnic group. And one of the solutions that some people have mentioned that the only way to ever bring peace to Iraq is to partition it into three countries. Sort of a Kurdistan, a Sunnistan, and a Shiistan portions of Iraq, because the long-standing racial and religious conflicts in Iraq are exacerbated by saying these three groups of people all form a country, but the lines are not a natural demarcation of a country. It's simply something that Westerners felt like, oh, we're going to draw a border and say this is a country. Now, it's hard to talk about Iraq without also talking about Iran. And one of the mistakes, again, we in the West often make is we tend to lump all Arab countries into one pot. We tend to think of all Muslims as Arabs. Well, of course, they're not. Arabia is the home of Arabs, but not all Muslims are Arabs. As a matter of fact, most Muslims are not Arabs. There are more Muslims in Indonesia than any other country. Iran is not an Arab country. Okay? Iran is not an Arab country. Iran is a Persian country. Iranians are not Arabs. Iranians are Persians. And Persia was a country of different religions. Again, mainly Zoroastrianism was the religion of Persia until the expansion of Islam back in the 7th century. Now, once Islam began to expand and explode, Iran, Persia became a Muslim nation. Now, the more recent history of Persia/Iran was, you may remember that the Shah of Iran was a very Western-friendly ruler. Actually, he was installed with the help of the United States in 1953. The U.S. was worried that Iran was being too cozy with the communist world, the Soviet Union-dominated part of the world back during the Cold War. And so the U.S., with some covert actions, helped for there to be regime change in Iran, helped the Shah to come to power in 1953. The Shah of Iran was very friendly to the West. The Shah of Iran was a very Western-type man. He was also extremely corrupt. He was also brutal. He had the secret police that would arrest and kill anyone who disagreed with him. He lived in an incredibly lavish lifestyle. And all of that put together, his abuses of power, his secret police, his lavish lifestyle, all of that led to a great discontent in Iran. And one of his most outspoken critics was a religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini was jailed for a couple of years, finally exiled in France. But Khomeini continued to preach from a distance. And we all know what happened. In 1979, Iran went through a violent revolution. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. And Iran went from being a very pro-Western nation to a very anti-Western nation with shouts of death to America. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, this religious leader who had been exiled, becomes not only the religious leader of Iran, he becomes the political leader of Iran. He is given the title of supreme leader. And so all power, both religious and government power, is centered in the Ayatollah. And that's the way it is today. The current supreme leader of Iran is also named Khomeini, spelled with one little letter's difference, but it sounds the same to our ears. But the current supreme leader of Iran is a very hardline, right-wing, conservative, Shia religious leader. And he has the power to trump anything the Iranian president or the Iranian legislature do. The supreme leader can simply say no. Now remember, Iran is a country that is 95% Shia. It is a Shiite nation, it is a Persian nation. And their law is based on an interpretation of strict Sharia Muslim law. They see Western things as dangerous. Now, the good news, I guess you would say, is that there is a movement in Iran for more openness, for more freedom, especially the population of Iran is very young. The young generation of Iran would like to have better relations with the West. The young generation of Iran would like to have a more open society. The supreme leader, the current Khomeini, is getting pretty old. He will have to be replaced, and the way in which they choose a new supreme leader, there is a group of men who select the next leader, and the hope is that the next supreme leader is a little more moderate, and that will allow for there to be a more openness towards the West and less death to America chanting. But Iran is a country where, again, during the Spring Awakening, the Arab Spring of 2011, many young Iranians thought this was a turning point. This was going to be an openness. There was going to be a new day in Iran. It has not yet come. Let me close by talking about a couple of other countries that whose version of Sharia law is perhaps most troubling. When we think of our friends and neighbors in the Middle East, one that we think of as a friend is Saudi Arabia. We do a lot of business with Saudi Arabia. We buy a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, right now here in Oklahoma, we are not very happy with Saudi Arabia because they have decided to simply flood the market with cheap oil, which has caused great harm in our economy here in the oil-producing parts of the U.S. But Saudi Arabia can afford to sell oil for incredibly cheap prices. Saudi Arabia takes up really almost all of the Arabian Peninsula. It was created in 1932 when Ibn Saud was able to unite 4 regions of the Arabian Peninsula into one nation. And that's where the name Saudi Arabia comes from the Saud family. The Saud family continues to rule Saudi Arabia. It is an absolute monarchy. And it is a Sunni nation that is a particular brand of Sunni Islam. It is Wahhabi. Wahhabi Sunni. in Saudi Arabia, which is a very conservative, very fundamentalist form of Islam. It is, if you remember, where was Osama bin Laden from? He was from Saudi Arabia. This Wahhabi style of Sunni Islam is very, very, very strict interpretation of Islam. Let me just read a little passage that tells how some of this plays out. Here are some of the things that are forbidden in Saudi Arabia. Listening to music, dancing, fortune-telling, a television program, unless it's a religious one, smoking, playing backgammon, playing chess, playing cards, drawing a human or animal figure, acting in a play, writing fiction, which is considered a form of lying. These are all forbidden, and you can be whipped for doing any of those things. Doctors are forbidden from dissecting cadavers, or police can't do that either. It is illegal to play recorded music over a telephone. It is illegal to send flowers to a friend in the hospital. And some of the other things that are contrary to this form of Islam include visiting the tombs of venerated leaders, including the tomb of Muhammad, celebrating birthdays. Women are forbidden from driving in Saudi Arabia. Men cannot cut their beards. You cannot celebrate any kind of foreign holiday like a Mother's Day or a Valentine's Day. You cannot even smile at a non-Muslim. You cannot wish a non-Muslim well on their birthday. It goes on and on and on. It is an incredibly strict version of Islam. Senior Wahhabi leaders in Saudi Arabia have determined that Islam forbids the traveling or working outside the home by a woman without her husband's permission. As I said, they're forbidden from driving. And if a woman has intercourse outside of wedlock, she can be beheaded. Although until 1962, it was okay to have sex outside of marriage with your slave woman. They did officially ban slavery in 1962. But when you think about Saudi Arabia, we're talking about an incredibly strict kind of Sharia law, incredibly medieval. If you steal, your hand is cut off. It is an incredibly fundamentalist version of Islam. And when you think about many of the movements of what we call radical Islam, are actually born in Saudi Arabia, which we think of as our friend, and in some cases they are. But that's where Osama bin Laden comes from this extremely conservative, extremely fundamentalist kind of Wahhabi Sunni Muslim. Speaking of incredibly conservative and incredibly troubling, let me just end by talking about something that was in the news just in the last few weeks, and that's the situation in Pakistan. Specifically a practice that is prevalent in Pakistan and in some other Muslim nations, but it seems to happen in Pakistan more than anywhere, and that is honor killing. Pakistan, remember, is a country that was created in 1947 on the Indian subcontinent as a place for Muslims as opposed to Hindus who live in India. In 1971, there was a civil war that ended up creating the separate nation of Bangladesh. Pakistan is about 80 to 90% Sunni, 5 to 10% Shia. But one thing that's been in the news a lot about in Pakistan is this idea of honor killing, where a family, the men in the family, the brothers, the father, the uncles, stone to death a young woman or a woman. And they kill their sisters and daughters for infidelity, for refusing to marry the man that has been selected for them, for asking for a divorce, for flirting, or, believe it or not, for being the victim of rape. In other words, if a woman in Pakistan is raped, her family will kill her for bringing dishonor on the family. As mind-blowing as that is, if a woman is raped, She is seen as someone who now has brought dishonor on her family, and so her brothers and father will kill her so that the dishonor brought on the family can be erased. The troubling thing, as if that's not troubling enough, the troubling thing is that the authorities in Pakistan ignore this. They don't get involved. They rarely charge the brothers and the uncles and the fathers with murder. Pakistani law allows a victim of murder for their family to get restitution from the family of the murderer and settle it that way. Well, in these cases, of course, it's the same family. And this has happened in other countries. It's even happened with Pakistani immigrants here in the U.S. But you can see this is almost the ultimate example of taking Islamic teachings and twisting them and turning them into something that is just repulsive. To murder a woman, to kill a woman, to stone a woman because she's a rape victim is almost the ultimate extreme of a horrible twisting of any religious idea. Often this is a pretext for other things happening. If the woman wants to marry outside of her clan, the brothers are afraid that the inheritance might go to someone outside of the clan, and they will commit this murder not for religious reasons, but for financial reasons. You can see that there are places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia where there is much to be troubled about, especially as different ways of carrying out and interpreting the teachings of the Quran. You also see a bright spot, like a place like Jordan, where you have a very progressive, compassionate society that happens to be Muslim, that is actually working and working as a neighbor to Israel. So it gives you hope that if we can have more Jordans out there, the world will be a better place. I hope that over the last 6 now sessions, you feel a little bit better informed about how these 3 great world religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, how they are the same and how they're different. How all would look back to Abraham as their patriarch, and yet going in 3 very different directions. I am a firm Christian. I believe Jesus Christ is the Messiah and the hope for the world. I believe as followers of Jesus, we are called to love our Jewish and Muslim friends and neighbors, to find ways to have relationships with them so that we might be able to share our faith in Christ, not in a way that would be offensive, not in a way that is condemning their faith, but perhaps in a way, in an open sharing back and forth that would allow us to testify and witness to what Jesus Christ has done in our lives and why we see him as the Messiah, the Son of God. I believe as we Christians live in an increasingly diverse society, we're going to have neighbors and co-workers and folks who are Muslim. And we may be their first Christian friend. And how we represent Jesus Christ in that relationship, how we're able to perhaps listen and then share in that relationship may give us the opportunity to share the good news of Jesus Christ. I hope that some of what we've talked about today will give us more of the tools to not only understand what's happening in the world and understand the religious diversity, but to be better evangelists, to be better ambassadors for Christ, and to be better equipped to share the good news. I've enjoyed teaching this to our class on Wednesday night. I've enjoyed now recapping it for the internet. And if you've enjoyed any of this and would like to pass it along to a friend, and you think they might be blessed by it, please feel free to share it, pass it along. And you never know what kind of seeds that might plant. Okay, good to see you, and God bless.